Mark Joseph, you've done an amazing job producing a movie called Reagan, and now you've written a book about the making of the movie. And I'm fascinated at several different levels, and thank you for being on my podcast. There's an interesting story of why you did this movie. What is it?
Well, I begin the movie, Steve, and for your audience, begin the book, I should say, with a story of me driving with my wife and four young daughters, I think under the age of 6, 5, something like that, driving in the Midwest. And I was coming to or from my cousin's wedding, and I'm pulled over for speeding. And not that I've never been known not to speed, but I did have a wife, four little girls, and a minivan. So I don't think I was Mario Andretti on this day. But I'm pulled over, and suddenly I'm informed that I'm speeding 20 miles over the speed limit because suddenly the signs had changed from 65 to 45 to 65 back and forth, and so I'm this dire criminal now, and I'm going to have to appear in court. The officer informs me to come back in person. This is how serious this is. And I'm trying to process all this information, and I look at the ticket, and it says you must appear in court in Dixon, Illinois. And it just dawns on me, I'm driving through Ronald Reagan's hometown, didn't even realize it. And now I've got a date with a judge in Dixon, Illinois. And so that's where the whole thing started. I can't say that I hadn't thought about it before, but I felt like it was some kind of, as Reagan would say, part of the DP, the divine plan, that I was to spend the night in Dixon. So we pull over, we go to the Holiday Inn. Of course, all of our plans have changed now, and I have to appear in court the next day. But I have 24 hours to kill, or a day to kill. And so we took in all the sights and saw where Reagan was a lifeguard and where he grew up and the church he went to. And so I got a crash course in Ronald Reagan against my will.
And it was at that church that you discovered some very interesting documentation. Tell me about it.
Yeah, I had heard about this from a Reagan biographer named Paul Kengor, and I chose to, but just to finish the story, so that before I hit that, the next day, I go before the judge, and just because of the kind of person I am, Steve, I presented him. I said, Your Honor, after I was pulled over, I decided to take some footage of what happens when I do go the speed limit. I'd like for you to see what happened, because people were flipping me off and cursing at me and swearing at me. To speed up. So I said, Your Honor, may I please show you the footage of what happens? And he just looks at me like I'm the stupidest kid on the planet and said, Son, I'm not going to watch your video. Plead innocent or guilty. That's your choice. And I've been warned by a bailiff or somebody that if you say innocent, he can actually throw you in jail until your trial. So I looked over at my four little girls sitting in the front row. I thought this would probably not be a good image for them for the rest of their life to see their dad taken away in handcuffs for a hearing later. So I said, guilty, Your Honor. I paid my $500 fine and went about my business. But yeah, the biographer Paul Kengor wrote, think of the hundreds and hundreds of books on Ronald Reagan. And it is, this is a very interesting part about historians that really is telling that nobody bothered to go to the church Reagan grew up in and say to the current pastor, hey, could I see the sermons young Ronald Reagan heard as a kid? Because it might have been helped form him as a person and what he later became. And Paul Kengor asked that question, and the current pastor said, they're in the basement. Nobody has ever asked to see them before. And so Paul was one of the first people to access those sermons. And what he discovered was not surprising when you think about it. And Ronald Reagan's pastor was a very fierce anti-communist type person. And he would preach often against the evils of totalitarianism in the Soviet Union. And he would even have speakers come in. And one of those speakers was a fellow named B.E. Kirchman, who traveled around the U.S. He was a Jewish fellow who had converted to Christianity and traveled around warning Americans through different churches about the dangers of communism. So all that kind of came together. And
this would have been not too long after the Bolshevik Revolution.
Correct.
But Reagan was a young man.
That's about a decade or so after that happened. And so this one man, B.E. Kirchman, we don't know a whole lot about him, except that he visited Reagan's church when he was 17 years old. And so that's kind of where the movie started, or the story started. And for me, it really helped understand Ronald Reagan. And you look at the trajectory of his life, he's often engaged, in fighting communism. And so it was really, the seeds were planted there.
Well, I'm an admirer of Ronald Reagan, as are many, many Americans, but I had never really known that connection, even though I knew he grew up in the Christian church. And there was also an interesting story about him being baptized.
Right. Yeah. This was a puzzle to me. When we're making films, and I've worked on dozens and dozens of films, that you have to understand the character to really make sense of the whole thing. I worked on the Ray Charles movie early on. I didn't produce it, but it was part of the company that I was at the time, called Walden Media and Crusader Entertainment. That's an example. What motivated Ray Charles? And so with Reagan, it was always a mystery, and I had to figure out, and I really had to go deep on in theology to understand it. Um, and part of it was at the age of 11 and a half, he finds his dad drunk in the snow. And it's a very, as you can imagine, for a young boy like that, to have to carry your dad up the steps as he's passed out. And his mother senses this is a critical moment in his life where he's going to go one way or the other. And so she gives him a book called That Printer of Udell's, which is a fairly nondescript Christian fiction book that, a dime store novel, we call it, the movie. But the story is about a young boy whose father's an alcoholic, and the boy finds God and grows up to become a U.S. congressman. And Reagan reads this book at 11 and a half, and he goes to his mother and says, I want to declare my faith and be baptized. And she explains that, you can't until you're 12, because we're disciples of Christ and you have to wait till you're 12. And he insists on being baptized at 11 and a half. He can't wait 6 months. And I thought, that's kind of odd. Why can't you just wait a few months? Not a big deal. But, as I studied that denomination, salvation is very much linked to baptism. It's not like most of us Protestants, like, we can be baptized later. It's no big deal. They really, value that in terms of salvation. And so I think my best guess is young Ronald Reagan couldn't go 6 months in this sort of undefined state that book had made him so passionate about that he insisted. So the preacher made a special exception and baptized him at 11 and a half.
I want to go a little deeper into his Christian faith, but first I want to ask you about some of the films that you've done. You made a reference to a couple of them just now. The one that I know best is No Safe Spaces with Dennis Prager, which I found fascinating, and I think it did fairly well at the theater. What are some of the other movies that you've done?
Yeah, I went to work for a company called Walden Media in 2000, and Walden and Crusader were two sister companies. And so we made the Ray movie, Holes, Because of Winn-Dixie, The Chronicles of Narnia, so many great movies that I got to be a part of and just have a front row seat. At the same time, Mel was doing The Passion of the Christ, and so I produced the soundtrack for the Inspired by soundtrack for that one. So I really had a front row seat at those early years of figuring out the audiences. And one of the mandates that I had was, let's go figure out how do we reach the rest of the country where, half the country goes to movies right now and the other half is kind of disengaged and protesting Hollywood. And how do we reach the audience? And so I really, I think even with Reagan, even though it's about a Republican president, we really sought to make it for everybody. And I think we, with the Chronicles of Narnia, for instance, that audience, by the way, I wrote a book a long time ago on that called The Lion, the Professor, and the Movies, Narnia's Journey to the Big Screen. But that's an example where you want to give, I think half the audience thinks that Aslan is Jesus Christ, and the other just thinks he's a cute lion. And that's okay. That's the way art is. You want to give, let both audiences enjoy the film as they would like to. And I think that's a mistake that sometimes is made in the faith film genre, is just pounding people over the head saying, you've got to have this interpretation. And I think it's important to, kind of give people that opportunity to enjoy it. But to answer your question, that was the first of about 75 movies that I've been a part of in one way or another, either developing or marketing or producing. And I do love biopics. I think America is such an interesting and unique place, and we have so many interesting people in our country, whether it's Charles Lindbergh or FDR or Ronald Reagan or Barack Obama or Steve Jobs. We just Elon Musk, Donald Trump. We have so many characters that are so interesting, and so I plan to do more like this. Reagan was the first one, but I plan to do a lot more in the future.
I was interested in the fact that this was not really a Christian movie. I know you well enough and long enough to know that you're a committed Christian. And I know there's kind of a fine line, but you didn't seem timid at all about weaving Christianity into it, as we just learned from the story you told us. But the story that caught me off guard was the one about a prophecy that was given to Reagan when he was governor in Sacramento. And I happen to know this story up close and personal because I included it in one of my books about Donald Trump. And so here I was watching your movie, enjoying it, and all of a sudden there was something I'd never seen in a secular movie, and that was, what we Pentecostals would call a word of prophecy. So tell us about that story and why you put it into the movie.
Yeah, it comes back to the character. And I don't think we do our characters any service. We do them a disservice by trying to paper over or make them milk toast. I mean, I have Ronald Reagan raised by an alcoholic father and a Bible thumping mother. So what more could you ask for a story? It's just great, right? So why pretend? I'm just a big fan of letting people be authentic. One of my pet peeves with my friends in Hollywood is, um, I have there's a religion columnist named Terry Mattingly who I've known for years, and Terry says that religion is often the ghost in people's stories, because if you don't understand that part of people, you will often misunderstand things about them. And just to give you one example, Michael Jackson, perpetually trying to be a child, recreate his childhood throughout his life. I think one of the factors is he was a Jehovah's Witness. He was raised Jehovah's Witness. Couldn't celebrate birthdays, couldn't celebrate Christmas. Gee, I wonder if that might have an impact on trying to recreate your childhood as an adult. Just throwing one example out there. So to understand Michael Jackson, you really have to understand that aspect of his life, and to pretend that didn't exist or didn't affect him is just not really realistic. And I just think for so many years, Steve, in media, I mean, you obviously are in this space and you're allowed to, talk about religion. But in Hollywood, it's just been a subject to avoid. And I trace it back even as far as, think about I Love Lucy. I'm sure you watched I Love Lucy, as we all did when we were kids. But, think about the two characters. Okay, so you've got Lucille McGillicuddy. That's an Irish name. My guess, I'd put my bet on the fact that she's Catholic. You got a Cuban guy. I'm guessing he's Catholic. You have two Catholics who get married in 1950 something. And yet we rarely, if ever, see priests. We don't see them going to mass. It just disappears from the show. And that's not honest. Two Catholics in 1950, I'm pretty sure there's a priest hanging around the house, or they're going to mass, or they're doing this or that. So it's almost like we unnaturally excise religion from stories because of some fear of offending somebody somewhere. And we don't understand the characters. And so in this case, that story was always interesting to me. Because remember, the film is told kind of in a psychological profile away from the John Voight character, Victor, who's telling the young guy about Reagan. And I think it's fascinating to how it affects people. When somebody tells you, I had a prophecy that you're going to do such and such, there's the ways that can affect you. Now, if you're an arrogant person, it's like, well, see, I knew I was going to be great. But most of us would kind of go, that was kind of interesting. That was kind of odd. And how does a person deal with that kind of situation? And even with that scene, if you noticed, Pat Boone, who was the last living person who was in that scene. So I know the historical veracity of it. that had happened, and he was there, and he told us exactly how it went down. Um, but I thought it was interesting from a character development point in that Reagan would have that happen to him a lot. People would come up to him and say, "We're praying for you." And he got that a lot. How do you keep that from going to your head, right? And one of the 55 people that I met with was Reagan's pastor. His name was Don Muma. And he said, when I went to see Reagan after he was shot, Reagan told me, I'm kind of paraphrasing him because he's not around anymore. But he said, basically, Reagan told me this was kind of like a brushback pitch from God, that maybe I'd gotten a little too full of myself. And this was God's way of reminding me, hey, I can take your life like that. Don't get so cocky. You just won this big election, but don't get too full of yourself. And so it does kind of speak to that. The other interesting thing is that prophetic moment happened in 1970. And it was a kind of conditional prophecy, right? That he said, if you do such and such, then you'll be president one day, basically. But in 76, when he loses, I talked to the man who was sitting next to Reagan the moment he lost to Ford. And I said, what did he say? He said, he turned to me and said, I guess it wasn't God's will. I thought that was really fascinating because the way our minds work, it seems like he was thinking, I must have screwed up somehow because it didn't happen like they said it was going to. And now he's thinking I'm too old for it to happen in 80. So, and then in 80, Pat Boone calls Reagan on election night. He said, I went through my, Rolodex, you call it back then. And he said, I had the number and I called and Reagan picked up on election night. And Pat said, he told us, he said, do you remember that day that you had that prophecy? And Reagan said, I've thought about it many times. And so I knew it was in his head, in the back of his head. And, but just one important point, you talked about filmmaking versus Christian filmmaking. We do that scene, but then we immediately you pull back to the two agents. So it's one KGB agent telling a young Russian leader about the story. And the young Russian guy goes, you don't believe that, do you? And the agent says, it doesn't matter if I believe it. Like, that's not my job. My job is to tell the story. And then a couple minutes later, Nancy Reagan says, that guy was a kook, basically. And so, again, you want to give the audience a chance to interpret it as they want to. And so somebody like you will give it credence and say, that was interesting. Maybe that was really God speaking. A more secular person will identify with the agents or Nancy. And I think it's just a fairness to the audience to give them that room for interpretation.
Well, Pat Boone is the one who told me the story, as you can understand. And he and two other couples and his wife, Shirley, visited the governor in Sacramento, and they were apparently walking across the yard. They decided to have a little prayer session. They joined hands in a little prayer circle, and suddenly George Otis Sr. starts giving this prophecy that you're referring to. In the movie, I thought it was interesting that Pat Boone played the part of George Otis Sr., and you had a younger actor who actually looked quite a bit like Pat Boone play his part. I just thought that was a very creative way to do it. And of course, I don't know that the audience necessarily knew the connection, but of course I did. And I found that fascinating. So you also, I read the book and I really enjoyed it. And really this interview is supposedly about the book, but where, you can't separate it from the movie itself. And you tell about meeting Ronald Reagan once. Tell me what happened and what was he like?
Yeah, by the time I got in to see him, so once he had the Alzheimer's diagnosis, they just wanted to carry on and have people visit him at the office. And so it was a really interesting time, I guess, in history where you could visit the president. And so when I learned about this, a friend of mine had gotten in to see him. And so I put my name in the hat too. They just wanted to create a feeling of him being, I've got to go to the office. I've got some meetings today. I've got a 2:00, a 3:00, and a 5:00, kind of a feeling for him and his Alzheimer's state. But he'd put on his suit and sit down at the office and his desk and chair, and so-and-so would come in. So in my case, I was ushered in, and they said, the way they spoke to him, it was interesting because the way she kind of in a sing-song way said, Mr. President, Mark Joseph is here to see you. So like I was the king of a country or something. and I walked in, and immediately I realized that he's just not there. I tried to engage a little bit, but I just couldn't really connect. And we got pictures and all that. But he had, I could tell he'd lost a few inches. I'm 6'1", and he looked like he maybe was 5'11" or so. Was the feeling. We put our arms around each other for the photo, and I noticed he put on a little weight there, so I could tell that. But it was just an interesting, as I turned around to leave, turned around and said something, "I'll love you," or something like that, and he kind of winked at me. So there was a little moment of recognition, but for the most part, he was not terribly engaging, and it's an awkward thing because in a situation like that, you don't want to ask something to confuse him, and so I just didn't know what to say really, other than, "Hey," as I was leaving, he said, "We all love you very much," and but he did wink, and that was 96, 97. And so I think of course, I didn't know I was making a movie about him later, but it just helped to get a sense of the man. It's always nice to be able to meet the character and, know what he's like and get a sense of a measure of the man. And so that was just a bonus that I didn't know I was preparing for the movie later.
Well, I thought that Dennis Quaid did a marvelous job portraying the president. I enjoyed it in the movie. I didn't really understand until I read the book what it was like to get him to agree to play it. But yet in the book, if I remember correctly, Dennis said that of the 150 or so parts that he's played, this was his favorite.
Yeah.
So, he A-list actor. How did you recruit him
Well,
to
it's
do it?
amazing, isn't it? He's been in 152 movies, and the movies he's been in, Parent Trap and The Rookie and Frequency and just so many great movies. And to have him say that is just about the greatest honor that I can, as a producer, that I can get. So that was really kind of him. Um, I'd always envisioned Dennis. We talked to other actors along the way, and I talk about it in the book, whether it was Jim Caviezel or Nicolas Cage or others. But I always just felt like Dennis had that natural Reagan vibe about him. You're just an optimistic person. And as I learned more about Dennis, there are really a lot of uncanny resemblances. Mother, again, very devout. Father, alcoholic, but a good time guy. Dennis would also talk about how his wife Meg Ryan, second wife Meg Ryan, would sometimes overshadow him, just as Jane Wyman overshadowed Reagan sometimes in their acting careers. And so there were a lot of remarkable similarities like that. And so I reached out to Dennis, and initially his agent said no, but then we worked around that, and we went out to dinner at Gladstone's, which is owned by my old friend Dick Reardon, the mayor of LA, and had dinner there. And I gave him, after a couple of hours, I gave him a Reagan hat replica, this cowboy hat. Sent me back like $250, but I gave it to him and I said, I would love for you to play the role. And he said, well, let me get back to you. And so he thought about it for a couple of days, and I remember my phone lit up and it said Dennis Quaid calling, and he said, Mark, that hat just doesn't fit. And I thought, oh, he's going to say no. He says, he paused for dramatic effect, and he said, but I think I can grow into it. And so we were off to the races at that point. And the first thing we did was I took him up to the Reagan Ranch, and we met with the Secret Service agent, John Barletta, who was Reagan's close pal and was with him for 20 years. And John just regaled us with stories, and Dennis later said that really helped him solidify his decision to do it, just to be there. And the ranch is exactly as Reagan left it. I mean, literally his closet, nothing has changed. The beds are exactly the way they were. And I think Dennis really felt his spirit there and really was confirmed that he was going to do it. But it's not an easy thing, to play. It's one thing to play Abraham Lincoln, because who's going to be around to say you're doing it wrong? They're all dead. But Ronald Reagan, people are still alive, and YouTube is around. And so if you get it wrong, there's a million people ready to tell you how you got it wrong.
Well, I thought he did a tremendous job. And of course, you tell a lot of behind the scenes stories, including that it took you 19 years from start to finish. And we really don't have time to do a deep dive into that, because I want to close by asking you about Hollywood. Most people who are conservative or go to church have this feeling that Hollywood is absolutely hostile to anything Christian or anything conservative. Yet you're an insider. Are things changing? What is your view of what's going on in Hollywood?
Well, it's hard to answer that in one broad stroke because there's many ways that intersect. I mean, the first thing I would say is it's a business, and so if people can be convinced, it's show business, and so if people can be convinced that there's a market and there's money to be made, um, you look for those people. I have one friend in particular who is literally a card-carrying member of the ACLU, and yet he wanted to put out this movie. He wanted to put out Dinesh D'Souza's movies. He's an old-fashioned liberal, and old-fashioned liberals like to hear different points of view. And so people like that there's a lot of folks like that. And then second of all, there's a lot of the faith-based movies that are out there that do well. And so, but yeah, are there challenges? Of course, and again, I don't think ours is a conservative or a faith-based movie, but we didn't hide the elements of that. And again, I wanted the characters to be able to be authentic and who they were. And so, yeah, there's always going to be challenges. And part of it is, I've written books in the past about music and how people of faith drop out of pop culture and retreat into their own venues. And, that's the more you do that, the more it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you're not there at the table, the more your values are not going to be reflected. And so I guess maybe I'm an old-fashioned liberal, but I love the old America where everybody got to throw their ideas in the mix. Before there was, before Christian music was segregated and this and that, we were all at the table and every community pushed for their beliefs. I think that's what made America so great, right? Was we all pushed and pulled and tugged, and this group fought for their rights and that group fought for their rights. And so anytime people unilaterally disappear, it's just not healthy. And so I've been really encouraged to see a lot of artists. I've written about this in the past in my books, faith returning to the mainstream. And certainly there are different movies that are just reflecting. But back to my I Love Lucy, we have to be able to tell stories authentically, and we shouldn't have to hide the faith elements and be afraid of offending that group or this group. And so, I mean, anyway, the big picture I would say is just be encouraged, and also remember that the things that you watch, that gets back to us in Hollywood. So if you complain about Hollywood, but then you go and watch the stuff you're complaining about, that registers as a sale, right? It's like voting, and so use your vote, wisely. When you watch or download a movie, that is essentially you voting at the box office for what you want more of. And so be sure you're not complaining about stuff and then voting for that stuff. Try to vote in sync with your beliefs.
My thanks to Mark Joseph for being on my podcast. I encourage you to go to Amazon and buy this book, Making Reagan. You can also get a DVD of the movie at Amazon, or at Amazon Prime. You can stream it, or at iTunes. I encourage you to watch the movie if you have it. It's outstanding. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.